than this day afforded. Yon lovely roadstead of Dominica, there it was that Rodney first caught up the French on the 9th of April, 3 days before, and would have beaten them there and then, had not a great part of his fleet lain becalmed under these very highlands, past which we are steaming through water smooth as glass. You glance again running down the coast of Martinique into a deep bay, ringed round with gay houses, embowered in mango and coconut, with the Piton du Vauclin rising into the clouds behind it. That is the cul-de-sac royal, for years the rendezvous and stronghold of the French fleets. From it Count de Grasse sailed out on the fatal 8th of April, and there beyond it opens an isolated rock of the shape but double the size of one of the great pyramids, which was once the British sloop of war Diamond Rock. For in the end of 1803, Sir Samuel Hood saw that French ships passing to Fort Royal Harbour in Martinique escaped him by running through the deep channel between Pointe du Diamante and this same rock, which rises sheer out of the water 600 feet and is about a mile round and only accessible at a point to the leeward, and even then only when there is no surf. He who lands, it is said, has then to creep through crannies and dangerous steeps round to the windward side, where the eye is suddenly relieved by a sloping grove of wild fig trees, clinging by innumerable air roots to the cracks of the stone. So Hood, with that inspiration of genius so common then among sailors, laid his 74, the Centaur, close alongside the Diamond, made a hawser, with a traveller on it, fast to the ship and to the top of the rock, and in January 1804 got 3 24s and 2 18s hauled up far above his masthead by sailors who, as they hung like clusters, appeared like mice hauling a little sausage. Scarcely could we hear the governor on the top directing them with his trumpet, the Centaur lying close under, like a coconut shell to which the hawsers are affixed. In this strange fortress, Lieutenant James Wilkie Morris, let his name be recollected as one of England's forgotten worthies, was established with 120 men and boys, and ammunition, provisions, and water for 4 months, and the rock was borne on the books of the Admiralty as His Majesty's ship Diamond Rock, and swept the seas with her guns till the 1st of June 1805, when she had to surrender for want of powder to a French squadron of 274s, a frigate, a corvette, a schooner, and 11 gunboats, after killing and wounding some 70 men on the rock alone and destroying 3 gunboats, with a loss to herself of 2 men killed and 1 wounded. Remembering which story, who will blame the traveller if he takes off his hat to His Majesty's quondam corvette, as he sees for the first time its pink and yellow sides shining in the sun, above the sparkling seas over which it domineered of old? You run onwards towards St. Lucia. Across that channel Rodney's line of frigates watched for the expected reinforcement of the French fleet. The first bay in St. Lucia is Gros Islet, and there is the Gros Islet itself, Pigeon Rock as the English call it, behind which Rodney's fleet lay waiting at anchor, while he himself sat on the top of the rock day after day, spyglass in hand, watching for the signals from his frigates that the French fleet was on the move. And those glens and forests of St. Lucia, over them and through them Sir John Moore and Sir Ralph Abercrombie fought, week after week, month after month, not merely against French soldiers, but against worse enemies, brigands, as the poor fellows were called, Negroes liberated by the Revolution of 1792, with their heads full, and who can blame them, of the rights of man and the democratic teachings of that valiant and able friend of Robespierre, Victor Hugues. They had destroyed their masters, man and woman, and child, horribly enough, and then helped to drive out of the island the invading English, who were already half destroyed, not with fighting, but with fever. And now St. Lucia the Faithful, as the Convention had named her, was swarming with fresh English, and the remaining French and the drilled Negroes made a desperate stand in the earthworks of yonder Morne Fortuné above the harbour, and had to surrender with 100 guns and all their stores. And then the poor blackfellows, who only knew that they were free and intended to remain free, took to the bush and fed on the wild kush-kush roots and the plunder of the plantations, man-hunting, murdering French and English alike, and being put to death in return whenever caught. Gentle Abercrombie could not coax them into peace. Stern Moore could not shoot and hang them into it, and the brigand war dragged hideously on till Moore, who was nearly caught by them in a 6-oared boat off the Piton, and had to row for his life to St. Vincent, so saving himself for the glory of Corunna, was all but dead of fever, and Colonel James Drummond had to carry on the miserable work till the whole Armée Française dans le Bois laid down their rusty muskets on the one condition that free they had been and free they should remain. So they were formed into an English regiment and sent to fight on the coast of Africa, and in more senses than one went to their own place. Then St. Lucia was ours till the peace of 1802, then French again under the good and wise Nogues, to be retaken by us in 1803 once and for all. I tell this little story at some length as an instance of what these islands have cost us in blood and treasure. I have heard it is regretted that we restored Martinique to the French and kept St. Lucia instead. But in so doing, the British government acted at least on the advice which Rodney had given as early as the year 1778. St. Lucia, he held, would render Martinique and the other islands of little use in war, owing to its windward situation and its good harbours. For from St. Lucia every other British island might receive speedy succour. He advised that the little Carenage should be made a permanent naval station, with dockyard and fortifications, and a town built there by government, which would, in his opinion, have become a metropolis for the other islands. And indeed nature had done her part to make such a project easy of accomplishment. But Rodney's advice was not taken, any more than his advice to people the island by having a considerable quantity of land in each parish allotted to 10-acre men, i.e. white yeomen, under penalty of forfeiting it to the Crown should it ever be converted to any other use than provision ground, i.e. thrown into sugar estates. This advice shows that Rodney's genius, though with the prejudices of his time he supported not only slavery but the slave trade itself, had perceived one of the most fatal weaknesses of the slave-holding and sugar-growing system. And well it would have been for St. Lucia if his advice had been taken. But neither 10-acre men nor dockyards were ever established in St. Lucia. The mail steamers, if they need to go into dock, have, I am ashamed to say, to go to Martinique, where the French manage matters better. The admirable Carenage harbour is empty. Castres remains a little town, small, dirty, dilapidated, and unwholesome. and St. Lucia itself is hardly to be called a colony, but rather the nucleus of a colony which may become hereafter, by energy and good government, a rich and thickly peopled garden up to the very mountain tops. We went up 800 feet of steep hill to pay a visit on that morn fortunae which Moore and Abercrombie took with terrible loss of life in May 1796, and wondered at the courage and the tenacity of purpose which could have contrived to invest and much more to assault such a stronghold, dragging the guns across ravines and up the acclivities of the mountains and rocks, and then attacking the works only along one narrow neck of down, which must be fat to this day with English blood. All was peaceful now. The forts were crumbling, the barracks empty, and the neat cottages, smiling flower gardens, smooth grass plats and gravel walks, which were once the pride of the citadel, replaced for the most part with guava scrub and sensitive plants. But nothing can destroy the beauty of the panorama. To the north and east, a wilderness of mountain peaks. To the west, the grand cul-de-sac and the carénage, mapped out in sheets of blue between high promontories, and beyond all, the open sea. What a land, and in what a climate, and all lying well nigh as it has been since the making of the world, waiting for man to come and take possession. But there, as elsewhere, matters are mending steadily, and in another 100 years St. Lucia may be an honour to the English race. We were, of course, anxious to obtain at St. Lucia specimens of that abominable reptile, the fer de lance, or rat-tailed snake, which is the pest of this island, as well as of the neighbouring island of Martinique, and, in Père Labat's time, of Lesser Martinique in the Grenadines, from which, according to Davy, it seems to have disappeared. It occurs also in Guadeloupe. In Great Martinique, so the French say, it is dangerous to travel through certain woodlands on account of the fer de lance, who lies along a bough and strikes, without provocation, at horse or man. I suspect this statement, however, to be an exaggeration. I was assured that this was not the case in St. Lucia, that the snake attacks no oftener than other venomous snakes, that is, when trodden on or when his retreat is cut off. At all events, it seems easy enough to kill him, so easy that I hope yet it may be possible to catch him alive, and that the zoological gardens may at last possess what they have long coveted in vain, hideous attraction of a live fer de lance. The specimens which we brought home are curious enough, even from this aesthetic point of view. Why are these poisonous snakes so repulsive in appearance, some of them at least, and that not in proportion to their dangerous properties? For no one who puts the mere dread out of his mind will call the cobras ugly, even anything but beautiful, nor again the deadly coral snake of Trinidad, whose beauty tempts children and even grown-up people to play with it, or make a necklace of it, sometimes to their own destruction. But who will call the puff-adder of the Cape, or this very fleur de lance, anything but ugly and horrible, not only from the brutality signified, to us at least, by the flat triangular head and the heavy jaw, but by the look of malevolence and craft signified to us at least by the eye and the lip. To us at least, I say, for it is an open question, and will be one as long as the nominalist and the realist schools of thought keep up their controversy, which they will do to the world's end, whether this seeming hideousness be a real fact, whether we do not attribute to the snake the same passions which we should expect to find, and to abhor, in a human countenance of somewhat the same shape, and then justify our assumption to ourselves by the creature's bites, which are actually no more the result of craft and malevolence than the bite of a frightened mouse or squirrel. I should be glad to believe that the latter theory were the true one, that nothing is created really ugly, that the fer-de-lance looks on hideous fiend, the ocelot a beautiful fiend, merely because the outlines of the ocelot approach more nearly to those which we consider beautiful in a human being. But I confess myself not yet convinced. There is a great deal of human nature in man, said the wise Yankee, and one's human nature, perhaps one's common sense also, will persist in considering beauty and ugliness as absolute realities, in spite of one's efforts to be fair to the weighty arguments on the other side. These fer-de-lance, be that as it may, are a great pest in St. Lucia. Dr. Davy says that he was told by the Lieutenant Governor that as many as 30 rat-tailed snakes were killed in clearing a piece of land, of no great extent near Government House. I can well believe this, for about the same number were killed only 2 years ago in clearing, probably, the same piece of ground which is infested with that creeping pest of the West Indies, the wild guava bush, from which guava jelly is made. The present Lieutenant Governor has offered a small reward for the head of every fer-de-lance killed, and the number brought in the first month was so large that I do not like to quote it merely from memory. Certainly it was high time to make a crusade against these unwelcome denizens. Dr. Davy, judging from a government report, says that 19 persons were killed by them in one small parish in the year 1849, and the death, though by no means certain, is, when it befalls, a hideous death enough. If anyone wishes to know what it is like, let him read the tragedy which Sir Richard Schomburgk tells, with his usual brilliance and pathos, for he is a poet as well as a man of science, in his Travels in British Guiana, Volume 2, page 255, how the Craspidocephalus, coiled on a stone in the ford, let 14 people walk over him without stirring or allowing himself to be seen, and at last rose and, missing Schomburgk himself, struck the beautiful Indian bride, the Liebling der ganzen Gesellschaft, and how she died in her bridegroom's arms with horrors which I do not record. Strangely enough, this snake, so fatal to man, has no power against another West Indian snake, almost equally common, namely the crebo. This brave animal, closely connected with our common water snake, is perfectly harmless and a welcome guest in West Indian houses, because he clears them of rats. He is some 6 or 8 feet long, black, with more or less bright yellow about the tail and under the stomach. He not only faces the fer-de-lance, who is often as big as he is, but kills and eats him. It was but last year, I think, that the population of Carenage turned out to see a fight in a tree between a crebo and a fer-de-lance of about equal size, which, after a 2 hours' struggle, ended in the crebo swallowing the fer-de-lance head foremost. But when he had got his adversary about 1/3 down, the Creoles, just as so many Englishmen would have done, seeing that all the sport was over, rewarded the brave crebo by killing both and preserving them as a curiosity in spirits. How the fer-de-lance came into the Antilles is a puzzle. The black American scorpion, whose bite is more dreaded by the Negroes than even the snakes, may have been easily brought by ship in luggage or in cargo. But the fer-de-lance, whose nearest home is in Guyana, is not likely to have come on board ship. It is difficult to believe that he travelled northward by land at the epoch, if such a one there ever was, when these islands were joined to South America, for if so, he would surely be found in St. Vincent, in Grenada, and most surely of all in Trinidad. So far from that being the case, he will not live, it is said, in St. Vincent. For, so goes the story, during the Carib War of 1795–6, the savages imported fer-de-lance from St. Lucia or Martinique and turned them loose in hopes of their destroying the white men. But they did not breed, dwindled away, and were soon extinct. It is possible that they, or their eggs, came in floating timber from the Orinoco. But if so, how is it that they have never been stranded on the east coast of Trinidad, with a timber without end drifts from the river? In a word, I have no explanation whatever to give, as I am not minded to fall back on the medieval one that the devil must have brought them thither to plague the inhabitants for their sins. Among all these beautiful islands, St. Lucia is, I think, the most beautiful. Not indeed on account of the size or form of its central mass, which is surpassed by that of several others, but on account of those two extraordinary mountains at its southwestern end, which, while all conical hills in the French islands are called pitons, bear the name the piton par excellence. From most elevated points in the island, their twin peaks may be seen jutting up over the other hills, like, according to irreverent English sailors, the tips of a donkey's ears. But as the steamer runs southward along the shore, these two peaks open out and you find yourself in deep water, close to the base of two obelisks, rather than mountains, which rise sheer out of the sea, one to the height of 2,710, the other to that of 2,680 feet, about a mile from each other. Between them is the loveliest little bay, and behind them green wooded slopes rise towards the rearward mountain of the Soufriere. The whole glitters clear and keen in blazing sunshine, but behind, black depths of cloud and grey sheets of rain shroud all the central highlands in mystery and sadness. Beyond them, without a shore, spreads open sea, but the fantastic grandeur of the place cannot be described in words. The pencil of the artist must be trusted. I can vouch that he has not in the least exaggerated the slenderness and steepness of the rock masses. One of them, it is said, has never been climbed, unless a myth which hangs about it is true. Certain English sailors, probably of Rodney's men, and numbering, according to the pleasure of the narrator, 330 or 3, are said to have warped themselves up it by lianes and scrub, but they found the rock ledges garrisoned by an enemy more terrible than any French. Beneath the bites of the fer-de-lance, and it may be beneath the blaze of the sun, man after man dropped and lay or rolled down the cliffs. A single survivor was seen to reach the summit, to wave the Union Jack in triumph over his head, and then to fall a corpse. So runs the tale which, if not true, has yet its value as a token of what, in those old days, English sailors were believed capable of daring and doing. At the back of these two pitons is the Soufriere, probably the remains of the old crater, now fallen in and only 1,000 feet above the sea, a golden egg to the islanders, where it is but used in case of war, and any difficulty occurring in obtaining sulphur from Sicily, A supply of the article to almost any amount might be obtained from this and the other like solfataras of the British Antilles. They being, so long as the natural distillation of the substance continues active, as at present, inexhaustible. But to work them profitably will require a little more common sense than the good folks of St. Lucia have yet shown. In 1836, two gentlemen of Antigua, Mr. Bennet and Mr. Wood, set up sulphur works at the Soufriere of St. Lucia, and began prosperously enough, exporting 540 tons of the first year. But in 1840, says Mr. Breen, the sugar growers took the alarm, fearing, it is to be presumed, that labour would be diverted from the cane estates, and at their instigation the Legislative Council imposed a tax of 16 shillings sterling on every ton of purified sulphur exported from the colony. The consequence was that Messrs. Bennet and Wood, after incurring a heavy loss of time and treasure, had to break up their establishment and retire from the colony. One has heard of the man who killed the goose to get the golden egg. In this case, the goose, to avoid the trouble of laying, seems to have killed the man. The next link in the chain as the steamer runs southward is St. Vincent, a single volcano peak like St. Kitts or the Basse Terre of Guadeloupe. Very grand are the vast sheets, probably of lava, covered with ash, which poured down from between two rounded mountains just above the town. Rich with green canes, they contrast strongly with the brown, ragged cliffs right and left of them, and still more with the awful depths beyond and above, where, underneath a canopy of bright white clouds, scowls a perfect darkness of cliffs and glens, among which lies unseen the Soufriere. In vain, both going and coming, by sunlight and again by moonlight, when the cane fields gleamed white below and the hills were pitch black above, did we try to catch a sight of this crater peak. One fact alone we ascertained, that like all, as far as I have seen of the West Indian volcanoes, it does not terminate in an ash cone, but in ragged cliffs of blasted rock. The explosion of April 27th, 1812, must have been too violent and too short to allow of any accumulation around the crater. And no wonder, for that single explosion relieved an interior pressure upon the crust of the earth which had agitated sea and land from the Azores to the West Indian Islands, the coasts of Venezuela, the Cordillera of New Granada, and the valleys of the Mississippi and Ohio. For nearly 2 years the earthquakes had continued, when they culminated in one great tragedy, which should be read at length in the pages of Humboldt. On March the 26th, 1812, when the people of Caracas were assembled in their churches beneath a still and blazing sky, 1 minute of earthquake sufficed to bury amid the ruins of churches and houses nearly 10,000 souls. The same earthquake wrought terrible destruction along the whole line of the northern Cordilleras, and was felt even at Santa Fe de Bogota and Honda, 180 leagues from Caracas. But the end was not yet. While the wretched survivors of Caracas were dying of fever and starvation, and wandering inland to escape from ever-renewed earthquake shocks among villages and farms which, ruined like their own city, could give them no shelter, the almost forgotten volcano of St. Vincent was muttering in suppressed wrath. It had thrown out no lava since 1718, if at least the eruption spoken of by Moreau de Jones took place in the Soufriere. According to him, with a terrific earthquake, clouds of ashes were driven into the air with violent detonations from a mountain situated at the eastern end of the island. When the eruption had ceased, it was found that the whole mountain had disappeared. Now there is no eastern end to St. Vincent, nor any mountain on the east coast, and the Soufriere is at the northern end. It is impossible, meanwhile, that the wreck of such a mountain should not have left traces visible and notorious to this day. May not the truth be that the Soufriere had once a lofty cone, which was blasted away in 1718, leaving the present crater ring of cliffs and peaks, and that thus may be explained the discrepancies in the accounts of its height, which Mr. Scrope gives as 4,940 feet, and Humboldt and Davy at 3,000, a measurement which seems to me to be more probably correct. The mountain is said to have been slightly active in 1785. In 1812 its old crater had been for some years, and is now, a deep blue lake, with walls of rock around 800 feet in height, reminding one traveller of the Lake of Albano. But for 12 months it had given warning by frequent earthquake shocks that it had its part to play in the great subterranean battle between rock and steam, and on the 27th of April 1812 the battle began. A Negro boy, he is said to be still alive in St. Vincent, was herding cattle on the mountainside. A stone fell near him, and then another. He fancied that other boys were pelting him from the cliffs above, and began throwing stones in return. But the stones fell thicker, and among them one, and then another, too large to have been thrown by human hand. And the poor little fellow woke up to the fact that not a boy but a mountain was throwing stones at him, and that the column of black cloud which was rising from the crater above was not harmless vapour, but dust and ash and stone. He turned and ran for his life, leaving the cattle to their fate, while the steam mitrailleurs of the Titans, to which all man's engines of destruction are but pop guns, roared on for 3 days and nights, covering the greater part of the island in ashes, burying crops, breaking branches off the trees, and spreading ruin, from which several estates never recovered. And so the 30th of April dawned in darkness which might be felt. Meanwhile, on the same day, to change the scene of the campaign 210 leagues, a distance, as Humboldt says, equal to that between Vesuvius and Paris, the inhabitants not only of Caracas but of Calabozo, situate in the midst of the Llanos, over a space of 4,000 square leagues, were terrified by a subterranean noise which resembled frequent discharges of the loudest cannon. It was accompanied by no shock, and what is very remarkable, was as loud on the coast as at 80 leagues distance inland. And at Caracas, as well as Calabozo, preparations were made to put the place in defence against an enemy who seemed to be advancing with heavy artillery. They might as well have copied the St. Vincent herd boy and thrown their stones too at the Titans, for the noise was, there can be no doubt, nothing else than the final explosion in St. Vincent far away. The same explosion was heard in Venezuela, the same time at Martinique and Guadeloupe, but there too there were no earthquake shocks. The volcanoes of the 2 French islands lay quiet and left their English brother to do the work. On the same day a stream of lava rushed down from the mountain, reached the sea in 4 hours, and then all was over. The earthquakes which had shaken for 2 years a sheet of the earth's surface larger than half Europe was stilled by the eruption of this single event. No wonder if, with such facts on my memory since my childhood, I looked up at that soufriere with awe, as at a giant, obedient though clumsy, beneficent though terrible, reposing aloft among the clouds when his appointed work was done. The strangest fact about this eruption was that the mountain did not make use of its old crater. The original vent must have become so jammed and consolidated in the few years between 1785 and 1812 that it could not be reopened even by a steam force, the vastness of which may be guessed at from the vastness of the area which it had shaken for 2 years. So when the eruption was over, it was found that the old crater lake, incredible as it may seem, remained undisturbed as far as had been ascertained, but close to it, and separated only by a knife edge of rock some 700 feet in height, and so narrow that, as I was assured by one who had seen it, it is dangerous to crawl along it. A second crater, nearly as large as the first, had been blasted out, the bottom of which, in like manner, is now filled with water. I regretted much that I could not visit it. 3 points I longed to ascertain carefully: the relative heights of the water in the 2 craters, the height and nature of the spot where the lava stream issued, and lastly, if possible, the actual causes of the locally famous Rabaka, or dry river, one of the largest streams in the island, which was swallowed up during the eruption at a short distance from its source, leaving its bed in arid gully to this day. But it could not be, and I owe what little I know of the summit of the Soufriere principally to a most intelligent and gentlemanlike young Wesleyan minister, whose name has escaped me. He described vividly, as we stood together on the deck, looking up at the volcano, the awful beauty of the twin lakes and of the clouds which, for months together, whirl in and out of the cups in fantastic shapes before the eddies of the trade winds. The day after the explosion, Black Sunday, gave a proof of, though no measure of, the enormous force which had been exerted. 80 miles to windward lies Barbados. All Saturday a heavy cannonading had been heard to the eastward. The English and French fleets were surely engaged. The soldiers were called out. The batteries manned, but the cannonade died away, and all went to bed in wonder. On the 1st of May the clock struck 6, but the sun did not, as usual in the tropics, answer to the call. The darkness was still intense, and grew more intense as the morning wore on. A slow and silent rain of impalpable dust was falling over the whole island. The negroes rushed shrieking into the streets. Surely the last day was come. The white folk caught, and little blame to them, the panic, and some began to pray who had not prayed for years. The pious and the educated, and there were plenty of both in Barbados, were not proof against the infection. Old letters describe the scene in the churches that morning as hideous. Prayers, sobs and cries in Stygian darkness from trembling crowds, and still the darkness continued and the dust fell. I have a letter written by one long since dead, who had at least powers of description of no common order, telling how, when he tried to go out of his house upon the east coast, he could not find the trees on his own lawn, save by feeling for their stems. He stood amazed, not only in utter darkness, but in utter silence. For the trade wind had fallen dead. The everlasting roar of the surf was gone, and the only noise was the crashing of branches, snapped by the weight of the clammy dust. He went in again and waited. About 1 o'clock the veil began to lift. A lurid sunlight stared in from the horizon, but all was black overhead. Gradually the dust cloud drifted away. The island saw the sun once more, and saw itself inches deep in black, and in this case fertilizing dust. The trade wind blew suddenly once more out of the clear east, and the surf roared again along the shore. Meanwhile, a heavy earthquake wave had struck part of at least of the shores of Barbados. The gentleman on the east coast going out found traces of the sea, and boats and logs washed up some 10 to 20 feet above high tide mark, a convulsion which seems to have gone unmarked during the general dismay. One man at least, an old friend of John Hunter, Sir Joseph Banks, and others their compeers, was above the dismay and the superstitious panic which accompanied it. Finding it still dark when he rose to dress, he opened, so the story used to run, his window, found it stick, and felt upon the sill a coat of soft powder. "The volcano in St. Vincent has broken out at last," said the wise man, "and this is the dust of it." So he quieted his household and his negroes, lighted his candles, and went to his scientific books in that delight, mingled with an awe not the less deep because it is rational and self-possessed, with which he, like other men of science, looked at the wonders of this wondrous world. Those who will recall that Barbados is 80 miles to windward of St. Vincent, and that a strong breeze from east-northeast is usually blowing from the former island to the latter, will be able to imagine, not to measure, the force of an explosion which must have blown this dust several miles into the air, above the region of the trade wind, whether into a totally calm stratum or into that still higher one in which the heated southwest wind is hurrying continually from the tropics towards the pole. As for the cessation of the trade wind itself during the fall of the dust, I leave the fact to be explained by more learned men. The authority whom I have quoted leaves no doubt in my mind as to the fact. On leaving St. Vincent, the track lies past the Grenadines. For 60 miles, long, low islands of quaint forms and euphonious names, Bequia, Mustique, Canono, Cariachu, Isle de Rhone, rise a few hundred feet out of the unfathomable sea, bare of wood, edged with cliffs and streaks of red and grey rock, resembling, says Dr. Davy, the Cyclades of the Grecian archipelago. Their number is counted at 300. The largest of them all is not 8,000 acres in extent, the smallest about 600. A quiet, prosperous race of little yeomen, beside a few planters, dwell there, the latter feeding and exporting much stock, the former much provisions, and both troubling themselves less than of yore with sugar and cotton. They build coasting vessels and trade with them to the larger islands, and they might be, it is said, if they chose, much richer than they are, if that be any good to them. The steamer does not stop at any of these little sea hermitages, so that we could only watch their shores, and they were worth watching. They had been, plainly, sea-gnawn for countless ages, and may, at some remote time, have been all joined in one long, ragged chine of hills, the highest about 1,000 feet. They seem to be for most part made up of marls and limestones, with trapdykes and other igneous matter here and there. and one could not help entertaining the fancy that they were a specimen of what the other islands were once, or at least would have been now had not each of them had its volcanic vents to pile up hard lavas thousands of feet aloft above the marine strata, and so consolidate each ragged chine of submerged mountain into one solid conical island, like St. Vincent at their northern end, and at their southern end that beautiful Granada to which we were fast approaching and which we reached on our outward voyage at nightfall, running in toward a narrow gap of moonlit cliffs, beyond which we could discern the lights of a town. We did not enter the harbour, but lay close off its gateway in safe, deep water, fired our gun and waited for the swarm of negro boats which began to splash out to us through the darkness, the jabbering of their crews heard long before the flash of their oars was seen. Most weird and fantastic are these nightly visits to West Indian harbours. Above, the black mountain depths with their canopy of cloud, bright white against the purple night, hung with keen stars. The moon, it may be on her back in the west, sinking like a golden goblet behind some rock fort, half shrouded in black trees. Below, a line of bright mist over a swamp, with the cocoa palms standing up through it, dark and yet glistening in the moon. A light here and there in a house, another here and there in a vessel unseen in the dark. The echo of the gun from hill to hill, wild voices from shore and sea, the snorting of the steamer, the rattling of the chain through the hawse hole, and on deck and under the quarter, strange gleams of red light amid patchy darkness, from engines, galley fires, lanthorns, and black folk and white folk flitting restlessly across them. The strangest show, like a thing in a play, says everyone when they see it for the first time, and when at the gunfire one tumbles out of one's berth and up on deck to see the new island, one has need to rub one's eyes and pinch oneself, as I was minded to do again and again during the next few weeks, to make sure that it is not all a dream. It is always worth the trouble, meanwhile, to tumble up on deck, not merely for the show, but for the episodes of West Indian life and manners, which, quaint enough by day, are sure to be even more quaint at night, in the confusion and bustle of the darkness. One such I witnessed in that same harbour of Granada, not easily to be forgotten. A tall and very handsome middle-aged brown woman, in a limp print gown and a gorgeous turban, stood on the gangway in a glare of light which made her look like some splendid witch by a Walpurgis night fire. "Tell your boatman to go round to the other side," quoth the officer in charge. "Fanka," Francois, "you go round other side of the ship." Fanka, who seemed to be her son, being sleepy, tipsy, and stupid, or lazy, did not stir. "Fanka, you hear what the officer say, you go round." No move. "Fanka, you not ashamed of yourself? You not hear the officer say he turn a steam pipe over you?" No move. "Fanka," authoritative. "Fanka," indignant. "Fanka," argumentative. "Fanka," astonished. "Fanka," majestic. Fanka, confidentially alluring. Fanka, regretful. And so on, through every conceivable tone of expression. But Fanka did not move, and the officer and bystanders laughed. She summoned all her talents and uttered one last "Fanka," which was a triumph of art, Shame and surprise were blended in her voice with tenderness and pity, and then again with meek despair. To have been betrayed, disgraced, and so unexpectedly by one whom she loved and must love still, in spite of this, his fearful fall. It was more than heart could bear. Breathing his name, but that once more, she stood a moment like a queen of tragedy, one long arm drawing her garments round her, the other outstretched as if to cast off, had she the heart to do it, the rebel, and then stalked away into the darkness of the paddle boxes, for ever and a day to brood speechless over her great sorrow. Not in the least. To begin chattering away to her acquaintances as if no Fanka existed in the world. It was a piece of admirable play-acting, and was meant to be. She had been conscious all the while that she was an object of attention, possibly of admiration, to a group of men, and she knew what was right to be done and said under the circumstances, and did it perfectly, even to the smallest change of voice. She was doubtless quite sincere the whole time, and felt everything which her voice expressed. But she felt it because it was proper to feel it, and deceived herself probably more than she deceived anyone about her. A curious phase of human nature is that same play-acting, effect-studying temperament which ends, if indulged in too much, in hopeless self-deception and the hypocrisy which, as Mr. Carlyle says, is honestly indignant that you should think it hypocritical. It is common enough among negresses and among coloured people too, but is it so very uncommon among whites? Is it not the bane of too many Irish, of too many modern French, of certain English for that matter, whom I have known, who probably had no drop of French or Irish blood in their veins? But it is all the more baneful the higher the organisation is, because the more brilliant the intellect, the more noble the instincts, the more able its victim is to say, "See, I feel what I ought, I say what I ought, I do what I ought, and what more would you have? Why do you Philistines persist in regarding me with distrust and ridicule? What is this common honesty, and what is this single eye which you suspect me of not possessing?" Very beautiful was the harbour of Georgetown seen by day. In the centre, an entrance some 200 yards across on the right, a cliff of volcanic sand interspersed with large boulders hurled from some volcano now silent, where black women with baskets on their heads were filling a barge with gravel. On the left, rocks of hard lava, surmounted by a well-lined old fort, strong enough in the days of 32-pounders. Beyond it, still on the left, the little city, scrambling up the hillside with its red roofs and church spires, among coconut and breadfruit trees, looking just like a German toy town. In front, at the bottom of the harbour, villa over villa, garden over garden, up to the large and handsome Government House, one of the most delectable spots of all this delectable land, and piled above it, green hill upon green hill, which, the eye soon discovers, are the sommers of old craters, one inside the other towards the central peak of Mount Maitland, 1,700 feet high. On the right bow, low, sharp cliff points of volcanic ash, and on the right again a circular lake, a quarter of a mile across and 40 feet in depth, with a coral reef, almost awash, stretching from it to the ash cliff on the south side of the harbour mouth. A glance shows that this is none other than an old crater, like that inside English Harbour in Antigua, probably that which has hurled out the boulders and the ash, and one whose temper is still uncertain, and to be watched anxiously in earthquake times. The Étang du Vieux-Bourg is its name, for, so tradition tells us, in the beginning of the 17th century the old French town stood where the white coral reef gleams under water, in fact upon the northern lip of the crater. One day, however, the Enceladus below turned over in his sleep, and the whole town was swallowed up or washed away. The sole survivor was a certain blacksmith, who thereupon was made, or as sole survivor made himself, governor of the island of Granada. So runs the tale, and so it seems likely to run again during the late earthquake at St. Thomas's. For on the very same day, and before any earthquake wave from St. Thomas's had reached Granada, if any ever reached it, which I could not clearly ascertain, this Étang du Vieux-Bourg boiled up suddenly, hurling masses of water into the lower part of the town, washing away a stage and doing much damage. The people were, and with good reason, in much anxiety for some hours after, but the little fit of ill temper went off, having vented itself, as is well known, in the sea between St. Thomas's and Santa Cruz, many miles away. The bottom of the crater, I was assured, was not permanently altered, but the same informant, an eye-witness on whom I can fully depend, shared the popular opinion that it had opened, sucked in sea water and spouted it out again. If so, the good folk of Georgetown are quite right in holding that they had a very narrow escape of utter destruction. An animated and picturesque spot, as the steamer runs alongside, is the wooden wharf where passengers are to land and the ship to coal. The coaling negroes and negresses, dressed or undressed in their dingiest rags, contrast with the country negresses in gaudy prints and gaudier turbans, who carry on their heads baskets of fruit even more gaudy than their dresses. Both country and town negroes, meanwhile, look, as they are said to be, comfortable and prosperous, and I can well believe the story that beggars are unknown in the island. The coalers indeed are only too well off, for they earn enough by one day of violent and degrading toil to live in reckless, shiftless comfort, and, I am assured, something very like debauchery, till the next steamer comes in. No sooner is the plank down than a struggling line getting on board meets a struggling line getting on shore, and it is well if the passenger, on landing, is not besmirched with coal dust after a narrow escape of being shoved into the sea off the stage. But, after all, civility pays in Granada, as in the rest of the world, and the negro, like the Frenchman, though surly and rude enough if treated with the least haughtiness, will generally, like the Frenchman, melt at once at a touch of the hat, and appeal to laissez passer, mademoiselle. On shore we got, through becold negroes, men and women safe and not very much becold ourselves, and were driven up steep streets of black porous lava, between lava houses and walls, and past lava gardens in which jutted up everywhere, amid the loveliest vegetation, black knots and lumps scorched by the nether fires. The situation of the house, the principal one of the island, to which we drove, is beautiful beyond description. It stands on a knoll some 300 feet in height, commanded only by a slight rise to the north, and the wind of the eastern mountains sweeps fresh and cool through a wide hall and lofty rooms. Outside, a pleasure ground and garden, with the same flowers as we plant in summer at home, and behind, tier on tier of green wooded hill, with cottages and farms in the hollows, might have made us fancy ourselves for a moment in some charming country house in Wales. But opposite the drawing-room window rose a candelabra cereus 30 feet high. On the lawn in front, great shrubs of red frangipani carried rose-coloured flowers which filled the air with fragrance at the end of thick and all but leafless branches. Trees hung over them with smooth, greasy stems of bright copper, which had gained them the name of Indian skin, at least in Trinidad, where we often saw them wild. Another glance showed us that every tree and shrub around was different from those at home, and we recollected where we were, and recollected too, as we looked up at the wealth of flower and fruit and verdure, that it was sharp winter at home. We admired this and that, especially a most lovely convolvulus. I know not whether we have it in our hothouses, with purple maroon flowers and an old hog plum, bombin of the French, a huge tree which was striking not so much from its size as from its shape. Growing among blocks of lava, it had assumed the exact shape of an English oak in a poor soil and exposed situation. Globular, headed, gnarled, stunted, and most unlike to its giant brethren of the primeval woods, which range upward 60 or 80 feet without a branch. We walked up to see the old fort, commanding the harbour from a height of 800 feet. We sat and rested by the roadside under a great cottonwood tree, and looked down on gorges of richest green, on negro gardens and gru-gru palms, and here and there a cabbage palm, or a huge tree at whose name we could not guess, then turned through an arch cut in the rock into the interior of the fort, which now holds neither guns nor soldiers. To see at our feet the triple harbour, the steep town and a very paradise of garden and orchard, and then down again with the regretful thought which haunted me throughout the islands. What might the West Indies not have been by now had it not been for slavery, rum and sugar? We got down to the steamer again, just in time, happily, not to see a great fight in the water between two negroes, to watch which all the women had stopped their work and cheered the combatants with savage shouts and laughter. At last the coaling and the cursing were over, and we steamed out again to sea. I have antedated this little episode, delightful for more reasons than I set down here, because I do not wish to trouble my readers with two descriptions of the same island, and those mere passing glimpses. There are two craters, I should say in Grenada, beside the harbour. One, the Grand Etang, lies high in the central group of mountains which rise to 3,700 feet, and is itself about 1,740 feet above the sea. Dr. Davy describes it as a lake of great beauty, surrounded by bamboos and tree ferns. The other crater lake lies on the northeast coast and nearer to the sea level, and I more than suspect that more would be recognized up and down the island by the eye of a practised geologist. The southern end of Grenada, of whatsoever rock it may be composed, shows evidence of the same wave destruction as do the Grenadines. Arches and stacks and low horizontal strata laid bare along the cliff, in some places white with guano, prove that the sea had been at work for ages, which must be many and long, considering that the surf on that leeward side of the island is little or none the whole year round. With these low cliffs, in strongest contrast to the stately and precipitous southern point of St. Lucia, the southern point of Grenada slides into the sea, the last of the true Antilles. For Tobago, Robinson Crusoe's island, which lies away unseen to the windward, is seemingly a fragment of South America, like the island of Trinidad, to which the steamer now ran dead south for 70 miles. It was on the shortest day of the year, St. Thomas's Day, at 7 in the morning, 11:30 of English time, just as the old women at Eversley would have been going round the parish for their goodieing, that we became aware of the blue mountains of North Trinidad ahead of us. To the west of them the island of the Dragon's Mouth, and westward again a cloud among the clouds, the last spur of the Cordilleras of the Spanish Main. There was South America at last, and as a witness that this too was no dream, the blue water of the Windward Islands changed suddenly into foul bottle green. The waters of the Orinoco, waters from the peaks of the Andes far away, were staining the sea around us, with thoughts full of 3 great names connected, as long as civilized man shall remain with those waters: Columbus, Raleigh, Humboldt. We steamed on, to see hills not standing out like those of the Isles which we had passed in intense clearness of green and yellow, purple and blue, but all shrouded in haze, like those of the Hebrides or the west of Ireland. Onward through a narrow channel in the mountain wall, not a rifle shot across, which goes by the name of the Ape's Mouth, banked by high cliffs of dark Silurian rock, not bare, though as in Britain, but furred with timber, festooned with lianes, down to the very spray of the gnawing surf. One little stack of rocks not 30 feet high and as many broad stood almost in the midst of the channel, and in the very northern mouth of it, exposed to the full cut of surf and trade winds. But the plants on it, even though through the glasses, told us where we were. One huge low tree covered the top with shining foliage like that of a Portugal laurel. All round it upright cereae reared their grey candelabra, and below them, hanging down the rock to the very surf, deep green, night-blowing cereus twined and waved, looking just like a curtain of gigantic stag's horn moss. We ran through the channel, then amid more low-wooded islands, it may be for a mile, before a strong back-current rushing in from the sea, and then saw before us a vast plain of muddy water. No shore was visible to the westward. To the eastward the northern hills of Trinidad, forest-clad, sank to the water. To the south lay a long line of coast, generally level with the water's edge, and green with mangroves or dotted with cocoa palms. That was the Gulf of Paria, and Trinidad beyond. Shipping at anchor and buildings along the flat shore marked Port of Spain, destined hereafter to stand not on the seaside but, like Lynn in Norfolk and other fenland towns, in the midst of some of the richest reclaimed alluvial in the world. As the steamer stopped at last, her screw whirled up from the bottom clouds of yellow mud, the mingled deposits of the Caroni and the Orinoco. In half an hour more we were on shore amid Negroes, coolies, Chinese, French, Spaniards, short-legged Guarean dogs, and black vultures. Chapter 3. Trinidad. It may be worthwhile to spend a few pages in telling something of the history of this lovely island, since the 31st of July 1499, when Columbus, on his 3rd voyage, sighted 3 hills in the southeast part. He had determined, it is said, to name the first land which he should see after the Blessed Trinity. The triple peaks seemed to him a heaven-sent confirmation of his intent, and he named the island Trinidad, but the Indians call it Hierre. He ran from Punta Galera at the northeastern extremity, so named from the likeness of a certain rock to a galley under sail, along the east and south of the island, turned eastward at Punta Galeota, and then northward round Punta Icaque, through the Boca Sierpe, or Serpent's Mouth, into the Gulf of Paria, which he named Golfo di Balena, the Gulf of the Whale, and Golfo Triste, the Sad Gulf, and went out by the northern passage of the Boca Drago. The names which he gave to the island and its surroundings remain, with a few alterations, to this day. He was surprised, says Washington Irving, at the verdure and fertility of the country, having expected to find it more parched and sterile as he approached the equator, whereas he beheld groves of palm trees and luxuriant forests sweeping down to the seaside, with fountains and running streams beneath the shade. The shore was low and uninhabited, but the country rose in the interior and was cultivated in many places, and enlivened by hamlets and scattered habitations. In a word, the softness and purity of the climate, and the verdure, freshness and sweetness of the country appeared to equal the delights of early spring in the beautiful province of Valencia in Spain. He found the island peopled by a race of Indians with fairer complexions than any he had hitherto seen, people all of good stature, well made, and of very graceful bearing, with much and smooth hair. They wore, the chiefs at least, tunics of coloured cotton, and on their heads beautifully worked handkerchiefs, which looked in the distance as if they were made of silk. The women, meanwhile, according to the report of Columbus's son, seem, some of them at least, to have gone utterly without clothing. They carried square bucklers, the first Columbus had seen in the New World, and bows and arrows, with which they made feeble efforts to drive off the Spaniards who landed at Punta Arenal, near Icaque, and who, finding no streams, sank holes in the sand, and so filled their casks with fresh water, as may be done, it is said, at the same spot even now. And there, the source of endless misery to these happy, harmless creatures, a certain Cacique, so goes the tale, took off Columbus's cap of crimson velvet and replaced it with a circle of gold which he wore. Alas for them! That fatal present of gold brought down on them enemies far more ruthless than the Caribs of the northern islands, who had a habit of coming down in their canoes and carrying off the gentle arawaks to eat them at their leisure, after the fashion which Defoe, always accurate, has immortalized in Robinson Crusoe. Crusoe's island is almost certainly meant for Tobago. Man Friday had been stolen in Trinidad. Columbus came no more to Trinidad, but the Spaniards had got into their wicked heads that there must be gold somewhere in the island, and they came again and again. Gold they could not get, for it does not exist in Trinidad, but slaves they could get, and the history of the Indians of Trinidad for the next century is the same as that of the rest of the West Indies, a history of mere rapine and cruelty. The Arawaks, to do them justice, defended themselves more valiantly than the still gentler people of Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and the Lucayas, but not so valiantly as the fierce cannibal Caribs of the Lesser Antilles, whom the Spanish were never able to subdue. It was in 1595, nearly a century after Columbus discovered the island, that Sir Robert Dudley in the Bear, with Captain Monk in the Bear's Whelp, with two small pinnaces called the Frisking and the Earwig, ran across from Cape Blanco in Africa, straight for Trinidad, and anchored in Cedros Bay, which he calls Curiapan, inside Punta Icaque and Los Galos, a bay which was then, as now, very full of pelicans. The existence of the island was known to the English, but I am not aware that any Englishman had explored it. 2 years before, an English ship, whose exploits are written in Hakluyt by one Henry May, had run in, probably to San Fernando, to get refreshing, but could not, by reason the Spaniards had taken it, so that for want of victuals the company would have forsaken the ship. How different might have been the history of Trinidad if at that early period, while the Indians were still powerful, a little colony of English had joined them and intermarried with them. But it was not to be. The ship got away through the Boca Drago. The year after, seemingly, Captain Whiddon, Raleigh's faithful follower, lost 8 men in the island in a Spanish ambush. But Dudley was the first Englishman, as far as I am aware, who marched for his experience and pleasure 4 long marches through the island, the last 50 miles going and coming through a most monstrous thick wood, for so is most part of the island, and lodging myself in Indian towns, poor Sir Robert, larding the lean earth as he stalked along, in ruff and trunk hose, possibly too in burning steel breastplate, most probably along the old Indian path from San Fernando past Savannah Grande, and down the Ortois to Mayaro on the east coast. How hot he must have been! How often, will we hope, he must have bathed on the journey in those crystal brooks beneath the balisiers and the bamboos. He found a fine-shaped and a gentle people, all naked and painted red, with ruku, their commanders wearing crowns of feathers, and a country fertile and full of fruit, strange beasts and fowls, whereof monkeys, babions, and parrots were in great abundance. His monkeys were, of course, the little sapajous, his babions, no true baboons, for America disdains that degraded and dog-like form, but the great red howlers. He was much delighted with the island, and ensconced himself, i.e. built a fort, but he found the Spanish governor, Berrio, not well pleased at his presence, and no gold in the island save marcasite, iron pyrites, considered that Berrio and his 300 Spaniards were both poor and strong, and so he had no reason to assault them. He had but 50 men himself, and moreover was tired of waiting in vain for Sir Walter Raleigh. So he sailed away northward on the 12th of March to plunder Spanish ships, with his brains full of stories of El Dorado and the wonders of the Orinoco, among them 4 golden half-moons weighing a noble each, and 2 bracelets of silver, which a boat's crew of his had picked up from the Indians on the other side of the Gulf of Paria. He left somewhat too soon, for on the 22nd of March Raleigh sailed into Cedros Bay and then went up to La Brea and the Pitch Lake. There he noted, as Columbus had done before him, oysters growing on the mangrove roots, and noted too that abundance of stone pitch, that all the ships of the world might be therewith laden from thence. And we made trial of it in trimming our ships to be most excellent good, and melteth not with the sun as the pitch of Norway. From thence he ran up the west coast to the mountains of Anaparima, St. Fernando Hill, and passing the mouth of the Caroni, anchored at what had been then the village of Port of Spain. There some Spaniards boarded him to buy linen and other things, all which he entertained kindly and feasted after our manner, by means whereof I learned as much of the estate of Guiana as I could, or as they knew. For those poor soldiers, having been many years without wine, a few draughts made them merry, in which mood they vaunted of Guiana and the riches thereof, much of which had been better for Raleigh had he never heard. Meanwhile the Indians came to him every night with lamentable complaints of Berrio's cruelty. He had divided the island and given to every soldier a part. He made the ancient caciques, that were lords of the court, to be their slaves. He kept them in chains. He dropped their naked bodies with burning bacon, and such other torments which, continues Raleigh, I found afterwards to be true. For in the city, San Joseph, when I entered it, there were 5 lords or little kings in one chain, almost dead of famine and wasted with torments. Considering which, considering Berrio's treachery to Whiddon's men, and considering also that, as Berrio himself, like Raleigh, was just about to cross the Gulf to Guiana in search of El Dorado, and expected supplies from Spain, to leave a garrison in my back interested in the same enterprise, I should have savoured very much of the ass. So Raleigh fell upon the corps du Garde in the evening, put them to the sword, sent Captain Caulfield with 60 soldiers onward, following himself with 40 more up the Caroni river, which was then navigable by boats, and took the little town of San Joseph. It is not clear whether the corps du Garde which he attacked was at Port of Spain itself, or at the little mud fort at the confluence of the Caroni and San Joseph rivers, which was to be seen with some old pieces of artillery in it, in the memory of the old men now living. But that he came up past that fort through the then primeval forest, tradition reports, and tells too how the prickling climbing palm, the croc-chien or hook-dog, pest of the forests, got its present name upon that memorable day. For, as the Spanish soldiers ran from the English, one of them was caught in the innumerable hooks of the croc-chien, and never looking behind him in his terror, began shouting, "Suelta mi Inglese! Let me go, Englishman!" Or, as others have it, "Valga mi Inglese! Take ransom for me, Englishman!" which name the palm bears, and to this day. So Raleigh, having, as one historian of Trinidad says, acted like a tiger lest he should savour of the ass, went his way to find El Dorado, and be filled with the fruit of his own devices. And may God have mercy on him, and on all who, like him, spoil the noblest instincts and the noblest plans for want of the single eye. But before he went, he called all the caciques who were enemies to the Spaniards, for there were some that Buero had brought out of other countries and planted there, to eat out and waste those that were natural of the place. And, by his Indian interpreter that he had brought out of England, made them understand that he was the servant of a queen, who was the great cacique of the north, and a virgin, and had more caciques under her than there were trees in that island, and that she was an enemy to the Castellani in respect of their tyranny and oppression, and that she was delivered all such nations about her as were by them oppressed, and, having freed all the northern world from their servitude, had sent me to free them also, and withal to defend the country of Guiana from their invasion and conquest. I showed them Her Majesty's picture, doubtless in ruff, farthingale, and stomacher laden with jewels, which they so admired and honoured, as it had been easy to make them idolatrous thereof. And so Raleigh, with Berreo as prisoner, hasted away towards his proposed discovery, leaving the poor Indians of Trinidad to be eaten up by fresh inroads of the Spaniards. There were, in his time, he says, 5 nations of Indians in the island: Jaios, Awacas, Salvoyos, Salivas, Nepoyas, and round St. Joseph, Carinapagotes, and there were others, he confesses, which he does not name. Evil times were come upon them, 2 years after the Indians at Punta Galera, the northeast point of the island, told poor Camis that they intended to escape to Tobago when they could no longer keep Trinidad, though the Caribs of Dominica were such evil neighbours to it, that it was quite uninhabited. Their only fear was lest the Spaniards, worse neighbours than even the Caribs, should follow them thither. But as Raleigh and such as he went their way, Berreo and such as he seem to have gone their way also. The conquistadores, the offscourings not only of Spain but of South Germany, and indeed of every Roman Catholic country in Europe, met the same fate as befell, if monk chroniclers are to be trusted, the great majority of the Normans who fought at Hastings. The bloodthirsty and deceitful men did not live out half their days. By their own passions, and by no miraculous nemesis, they civilized themselves off the face of the earth, and to them succeeded, as to the conquerors at Hastings, a nobler and gentler type of invaders. During the first half of the 17th century, Spaniards of ancient blood and high civilization came to Trinidad and resettled the island, especially the family of Farfan de los Godos, once famous in medieval chivalry, if they will allow me the pleasure of for once breaking a rule of mine and mentioning a name, who seem to have inherited for some centuries the old blessings of Psalm 37. Put thou thy trust in the Lord, and be doing good. Dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. The Lord knoweth the days of the godly, and their inheritance shall endure for ever. They shall not be confounded in perilous times, and in the days of dearth they shall have enough. Toward the end of the 17th century, the Indians summoned up courage to revolt after a foolish, ineffectual fashion. According to tradition and an old romance muy doloroso, which might have been heard sung within the last 100 years, the governor, the cabildo, and the clergy went to witness an annual feast of the Indians at Arena, a sandy spot, as its name signifies, near the central mountain of Tamana. In the middle of one of their warlike dances, the Indians at a given signal discharged a flight of arrows, which killed the governor, all the priests, and almost all the rest of the whites. Only a Farfan escaped, not without suspicion of forewarning by the rebels. He may have been a merciful man and just. While considering the gentle nature of the Indians, it is possible that some at least of their victims deserved their fate, and that the poor savages had wrongs to avenge which had become intolerable. As for the murder of the priests, we must remember always that the Inquisition was then in strength throughout Spanish America, and could be, if it chose, aggressive and ruthless enough. By the end of the 17th century, there were but 15 pueblos or Indian towns in the island, and the smallpox had made fearful ravages among them. Though they were not forced to work as slaves, a heavy capitation tax, amounting over most of the islands to $2 a head, was laid on them almost to the end of the last century. There seems to have been no reason in the nature of things why they should not have kept up their numbers, for the island was still, 19/20 of it, rich primeval forest. It may have been that they could not endure the confined life in the pueblos, or villages, to which they were restricted by law. But, for some cause or another, they died out, and that before far inferior numbers of invaders. In 1783, when the numbers of the whites were only 126, of the free coloreds 295, and of the slaves 310, the Indians numbered only 2,032. In 1798, after the great immigration from the French West Indies, there were but 1,082 Indians in the island. It is true that the white population had increased meanwhile to 2,151, the free coloured to 4,476, and the slaves to 10,000. But there was still room in plenty for 2,000 Indians. Probably many of them had been absorbed by intermarriage with the invaders. At present, there is hardly an Indian of certainly pure blood in the island, and that only in the northern mountains. Trinidad ought to have been, at least for those who were not Indians, a happy place from the 17th almost to the 19th century. If it be true that happy is the people who have no history. Certain Dutchmen, whether men of war or pirates is not known, attacked it sometime toward the end of the 17th century, and, trying to imitate Raleigh, were well beaten in the jungles between the Caroni and San Josef. The Indians, it is said, joined the Spaniards in the battle, and the little town of San Josef was rewarded for its valour by being raised to the rank of a city by the King of Spain. The next important event which I find recorded is after the Treaty of 27th of August 1701 between His Most Christian and His Most Catholic Majesty, by which the Royal Company of Guinea, established in France, was allowed to supply the Spanish colonies with 4,800 Negroes per annum for 10 years, of whom Trinidad took some share, and used them in planting cacao. So much the worse for it. Next, Captain Teach, better known as Blackbeard, made his appearance about 1716 off Port of Spain, plundered and burnt a brig laden with cacao, and when a Spanish frigate came in and cautiously cannonaded him at a distance, sailed leisurely out of the Boca Grande. Little would any Spanish guarda costa trouble the soul of the valiant Captain Teach, with his 6 pistols slung in bandoliers down his breast, lighted matches stuck underneath the brim of his hat, and his famous black beard, the terror of all merchant captains from Trinidad to Guinea River, twisted into tails and tied up with ribbons behind his ears. How he behaved himself for some years as a ferocious human pig like Ignatius Loyola before his conversion, with the one virtue of courage. How he would blow out the candle in his cabin and fire at random into his crew, on the ground that if he did not kill one of them now and then, they would forget who he was. How he would shut down the hatches and fill the ship with the smoke of brimstone and what not, to see how long he and his could endure a certain place, to which they are, some of them, but too probably gone. How he has buried his money, or said that he had, where none but he and Satan could find it, and the longest liver should take all. how out of some such tradition Edgar Poe built up the wonderful tale of the gold bug, how the planters of certain southern states and even the governor of North Carolina paid him blackmail and received blackmail from him likewise. And lastly, how he met a man as brave as he, but with a clear conscience and a clear sense of duty, in the person of Mr. Robert Maynard, first lieutenant of the Pearl, who found him after endless difficulties and fought him hand to hand in Oberacocke River in Virginia, the lieutenant and 12 men against Blackbeard and 14, till the sea was tinctured with blood around the vessel, and how Maynard sailed into Bathtown with the gory head, Blackbeard and all, hung at his jibboom end. All this is written in the books in which it is written, which need not be read now, however sensational, by the British public. The next important event which I find recorded in the annals of Trinidad is that in 1725 the cacao crop failed. Some perhaps would have attributed the phenomenon to a comet, like that Sir William Beeston, who, writing in 1664, says, "About this time appeared first the comet, which was the forerunner of the blasting of the cacao trees, when they generally failed in Jamaica, Cuba, and Hispaniola." But no comet seems to have appeared in 1725, whereupon to lay the blame, and therefore Father Gumilla, the Jesuit, may have been excused for saying that the failure of the trees was owing to the planters not paying their tithes, and for fortifying his statement by the fact that one planter alone, named Robello, who paid his tithes duly, saved his trees and his crop. The wicked, according to D'Auxion Lavesa, a Frenchman inoculated somewhat with scientific and revolutionary notions, who wrote a very clever book, unfortunately very rare now, said that the Trinidad cacao was then, as now, very excellent, that therefore it was sold before it was gathered, and that thus the planters were able to evade the payment of tithes. But Senor Rebelo had planted another variety called Forastero from the Brazils, which was at once of hardier habit, inferior quality, and slower ripening. Hence his trees withstood the blight. But, en revanche, hence also merchants would not buy his crop before it was picked. Thus his duty became his necessity, and he could not help paying his tithes. Be that as it may, the good folk of Trinidad, and to judge from their descendants there must have been good folk among them, grew, from the failure of the cacao plantations, exceeding poor, so that in 1733 they had to call a meeting at St. Joseph, in order to tax the inhabitants according to their means, toward thatching the Cabildo Hall with palm leaves. Nay, so poor did they become, that in 1740, the year after the smallpox had again devastated the island, and the very monkeys had died of it, as the hapless creatures died of cholera in hundreds a few years since, and of yellow fever of the year before last, sensibly diminishing their numbers near the towns, let the conceit of human nature wince under the fact as it will, it cannot wince from under the fact, in 1740, I say the war between Spain and England, that about Jenkins's ear forced them to send a curious petition to His Majesty of Spain and to ask, would he be pleased to commiserate their situation? The failure of the cacao had reduced them to such a state of destitution that they could not go to Mass save once in a year to fulfill their annual precepts, when they appeared in clothes borrowed from each other. Nay, it is said by those who should know best that in those days the whole august body of the Cabildo had but one pair of small clothes, which did duty among all the members. Let no one be shocked. The small clothes desiderated would have been of black satin, probably embroidered, and fit, though somewhat threadbare, for the thigh of a magistrate and gentleman of Spain. But he would not have gone on ordinary days in a sans-culottic state. He would have worn that most comfortable of loose nether garments which may be seen on sailors in prints of the Great War, and which came in again a while amongst the cunningest Highland sportsmen, namely, slops. Let no one laugh, either at least in contempt, as the average British Philistine will think himself bound to do, at the fact that these men had not only no balance at their bankers, but no bankers with whom to have a balance. No men are more capable of supporting poverty with content and dignity than the Spaniards of the old school, for none are more perfect gentlemen, or more free from the base modern belief that money makes the man, and I doubt not that a member of the old Cabildo of San Josef in slops was far better company than an average British Philistine in trousers. So slumbered on, only awakening to an occasional gentle revolt against their priests or the governor sent to them from the Spanish court, the good Spaniards of Trinidad, till the peace of 1783 woke them up, and they found themselves suddenly in a new and an unpleasantly lively world. Rodney's victories had crippled Spain utterly, and crippled too the French West Indian islands, though not France itself, but the shrewd eye of a Monsieur Rome de Saint Laurent had already seen in Trinidad a mine of wealth, which might be set up again, not the Spanish West Indians merely, but those of the French West Indians, who had exhausted, as they fancied, by bad cultivation, the soils of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and St. Lucia. He laid before the intendant at Caracas, on whom Trinidad then depended, a scheme of colonization, which was accepted and carried out in 1783 by a man who, as far as I can discover, possessed a preeminent degree, that instinct of ruling justly, wisely, gently, and firmly, which is just as rare in this age as it was under the Ancien Régime. Don Joseph Maria Chacon was his name, a man, it would seem, like poor Kaiser Joseph of Austria, born before his time. Among his many honourable deeds, let this one be at least remembered, that he turned out of Trinidad the last inquisitor who ever entered it. Foreigners who must be Roman Catholics, though on this point Chacon was as liberal as public opinion allowed him to be, were invited to settle on grants of crown land. Each white person of either sex was to have some 32 acres and half that quantity for every slave that he should bring. Free people of colour were to have half the quantity, and a long list of conditions was annexed, which, considering that they were tainted with the original sin of slaveholding, seemed wise and just enough. 2 articles especially prevented, as far as possible, absenteeism. Settlers who retired from the island might take away their property, but they must pay 10% on all which they had accumulated, and their lands reverted to the Crown. Similarly, if the heirs of a deceased settler should not reside in the colony, 15% was to be levied on the inheritance. Well had it been for every West Indian island, British or other, if similar laws had been in force in them for the last 100 years. So into Trinidad poured, for good and evil, a mixed population, principally French, to the number of some 12,000, till within a year or two the island was Spanish only in name. The old Spaniards, who held many of them large sheets of forest which they had never cleared, had to give them up, with grumblings and heartburnings to the newcomers. The boundaries of these lands were uncertain. The island had never been surveyed, and no wonder. The survey has only been completed during the last few years, and it is a mystery to the non-scientific eye how it ever got done. One can well believe the story of the northern engineer who, when brought over to plan out a railroad, shook his head at first sight of the high woods. "At home," quoth he, "one works outside one's work. Here one works inside it." Considering the density of the forests, one may as easily take a general sketch of a room from underneath the carpet as of Trinidad from the ground. However, thanks to the energy of a few gentlemen who found occasional holes in the carpet through which they could peep, the survey of Trinidad is now about complete. But in those days, ignorance of the island, as well as the battle between old and new interests, brought lawsuits and all but civil war. Many of the French settlers were no better than they should be. Many had debts in other islands. Many of the Negroes had been sent thither because they were too great ruffians to be allowed at home. And what was worse, the premium of 16 acres of land for every slave imported called up a system of stealing slaves, and sometimes even free coloured people, from other islands, especially from Grenada, by means of artful Negroes and mulatto slaves, who were sent over as crimps. I shall not record the words in which certain old Spaniards described the new population of Trinidad 90 years ago. They, of course, saw everything in the blackest light, and the colony has long since weeded and settled itself under a course of good government. But poor Don Joseph Maria Chacon might have had a hard time of it while he tried to break into something like order such a motley crew. He never broke them in, poor man, for just as matters were beginning to right themselves, the French Revolution broke out, and every French West Indian island burst into flame. Physical, alas, as well as moral. Then hurried into Trinidad, to make confusion worse confounded, French royalist families escaping from the horrors in Haiti, and brought with them, it is said, many still faithful house slaves born on their estates. But the Republican French, being nearly 10-1, were practical masters of the island, and Don Chacon, whenever he did anything unpopular, had to submit to manifestations with tricolour flag, Marseillaise and Sa Ira about the streets of Port of Spain, and to be privately informed by Admiral Artizabal that a guillotine was getting ready to cut off the heads of all loyal Spaniards, French and British. This may have been an exaggeration, but wild deeds were possible enough in those wild days. Artizabal, the story goes, threatened to hang a certain ringleader, name not given, at his yardarm. Chacon begged the man's life, and the fellow was spared to become the persecutor of his preserver, even to banishment and death from a broken heart. At last the explosion came. The English sloop Zebra was sent down into the Gulf of Paria to clear it of French privateers, manned by the defeated Maroons and brigands of the French islands, who were paying respect to no flag but pirating indiscriminately. Chacon confessed himself glad enough to have them exterminated. He himself could not protect his own trade, but the neutrality of the island must be respected. Skinner, the Zebra's captain, sailed away towards the Boca and found, to his grim delight, that the privateers had mistaken him for a certain English merchantman, whom they had blockaded in Port of Spain and were giving him chase. He let them come up and try to board, and what followed may be easily guessed. In 3/4 of an hour they were all burnt, sunk, or driven on shore. The remnant of their crews escaped to Port of Spain to join the French Republicans and vow vengeance. Then, in a hapless hour, Captain Vaughan came into Port of Spain in the Alarm frigate. His intention was, of course, to protect the British and Spanish. They received him with open arms, but the privateers' men attacked a boat's crew of the Alarm, were beaten, raised a riot and attacked a Welsh lady's house where English officers were at a party. After which, with pistol shots and climbing over back walls, the English, by help of a few Spanish gentlemen, escaped, leaving behind them their surgeon severely wounded. Next morning at sunrise, almost the whole of the frigate's crew landed in Port of Spain, fully armed with Captain Vaughan at their head. The hot Welsh blood boiling in him, he unfurled the British flag and marched into the town to take vengeance on the mob. A Spanish officer with 2 or 3 men came forward. What did a British captain mean by violating the law of nations? Vaughan would chastise the rascally French who had attacked his men. Then he must either kill the Spaniard or take him prisoner, and the officer tendered his sword. "I will not accept arms of a brave man who is doing his duty," quoth poor over-valiant Vaughan, and put him aside. The hot Welsh blood was nevertheless the blood of a gentleman. They struck up "Britons Strike Home" and marched on. The British and Spanish came out to entreat him. If a fight began, they would be all massacred. Still he marched on. The French, with 3,000 or 4,000 slaves, armed and mounting the tricolour cockade, were awaiting them, seemingly on the savannah north of the town. Chacon was at his wits' end. He had but 80 soldiers, who said openly they would not fire on the English, but on the French. But the English were but 240, and the French 12 times that number. By deft cutting through cross streets, Chacon got between the two bodies of madmen, and pleaded the indignity to Spain and the violation of neutral ground. The English must fight him before they fought the French. They would beat him, but as soon as the first shot was fired, the French would attack them likewise, and both parties alike would be massacred in the streets. The hot Welsh blood cooled down before reason and courage. Vaughan saluted Chacon and marched back, hooted by the Republicans, who nevertheless kept at a safe distance. The French hunted every English and Irish person out of the town, some escaping barely with their lives. Only 1 man, however, was killed, and he, poor faithful slave, was an English negro. Vaughan saw that he had done wrong, that he had possibly provoked a war, and made for his error the most terrible reparation which a man can make. His fears were not without foundation. His conduct formed the principal count in the list of petty complaints against England, on the strength of which, 5 months after, in October 1796, Spain declared war against England, and, in conjunction with France and Holland, determined once more to dispute the empire of the seas. The moment was well chosen. England looked to those who did not know her pluck to have sunk very low. Franco was rising fast, and Buonaparte had just begun his Italian victories. So the Spanish court, or at least Godoy, Prince of Peace, sought to make profit out of the French Republic. About the first profit which it made was the Battle of St. Vincent. About the second, the loss of Trinidad. On February the 14th, while Jervis and Nelson were fighting off Cape St. Vincent, Harvey and Abercrombie came into Chiriacu, and the Grenadines, with a gallant armada, 7 ships of the line, 13 other men of war, and nigh 8,000 men, including 1,500 German Jägers on board. On the 16th they were struggling with currents off Bocas, piloted by Mandingo Negro Alfred Sharper, who died in 1836, 105 years of age. The line of battleships anchored in the magnificent landlocked harbour of Chaguaramas, just inside the Boca de Monos. The frigates and transports went up within 5 miles of Port of Spain. Poor Chacon had, to oppose this great armament, 5,000 Spanish troops, 300 of them just recovering from yellow fever, a few old Spanish militia who loved the English better than the French, and what Republican volunteers he could get together. They, of course, clamoured for arms and demanded to be led against the enemy, forgetting as to this day that all the fiery valour of Frenchmen is of no avail without officers, and without respect for those officers. Beside them there lay under a little fort on Gaspar Grande Island in Chaguaramas harbour, what a paradise to be denied by war, 4 Spanish line of battleships and a frigate. Their admiral, Apodaca, was a foolish old devotee. Their crews numbered 1,600 men, 400 of whom were in hospital with yellow fever, and many only convalescent. The terrible Victor Hugues, it is said, offered a band of Republican sympathizers from Guadeloupe, but Chacon had no mind to take that Trojan horse within his fortress. We have too many lawless Republicans here already. Should the king send me aid, I will do my duty to preserve his colony for the crown. If not, it must fall into the hands of the English, whom I believe to be generous enemies, and more to be trusted than treacherous friends. What was to be done? Perhaps only that which was done. Apodaca set fire to his ships, either in honest despair or by orders from the Prince of Peace. At least he would not let them fall into English hands. At 3 in the morning, Port of Spain woke up all aglare with the blaze 6 miles away to the northwest. Negroes ran and shrieked, carrying this and that up and down upon their heads. Spaniards looked out aghast. Frenchmen cried, "Aux armes!" and sang the Marseillaise. And still over the 5 islands rose the glare. But the night was calm. The ships burnt slowly, and the San Damaso was saved by English sailors. So goes the tale, which, if it be as I believe, correct, ought to be known to those adventurous Yankees who have talked more than once of setting up a company to recover the Spanish ships and treasure sunk in the Chaguaramas. For the ships burned before they sunk, and Apodaca, being a prudent man, landed, or is said to have landed, all the treasure on the Spanish Main opposite. He met Chacon in Port of Spain at daybreak. The good governor, they say, wept, but did not reproach. The admiral crossed himself, and when Chacon said, "All is lost," answered, or did not answer, for the story, like most good stories, is said not to be quite true. "Not all. I saved the image of San Iago de Compostela, my patron and my ships." His ship's patron, however, says Monsieur Joseph, was St. Vincent. Why tell the rest of the story? It may well be guessed. The English landed in force. The French Republicans, how does history repeat itself? Broke open the arsenal, overpowering the Spanish Guard, seized some 3,000 to 5,000 stand of arms, and then never used them, but retired into the woods. They had, many of them, fought like tigers in other islands, some, it may be, under Victor Hugues himself. But here they had no leaders. The Spanish, overpowered by numbers, fell back across the dry river to the east of the town and got on a height. The German Jagers climbed the beautiful Laventille hills and commanded the Spanish and the two paltry mud forts on the slopes, and all was over, happily with almost no loss of life. Chacon was received by Abercrombie and Harvey with every courtesy. A capitulation was signed which secured the honours of war to the military, and law and safety to the civil inhabitants, and Chacon was sent home to Spain to be tried by a court-martial, honourably acquitted, and then, by French Republican intrigues, calumniated, memorialised against, subscribed against, and hunted, Buonaparte having, with his usual meanness, a hand in the persecution, into exile and penury in Portugal. At last his case was heard a second time and tardy justice done, not by popular clamour, but by fair and deliberate law. His nephew set out to bring the good man home in triumph. He found him dying in a wretched Portuguese inn. Chacon heard that his honour was cleared at last, and so gave up the ghost. Thus ended, as earth's best men have too often ended, the good Don Alonso Chacon. His only monument in the island is one, after all, era perennius, namely that most beautiful flowering shrub which bears his name. Varsivicia, some call it, others Calicophyllum. But the botanists of the island continue loyally the name of Chaconia to those blazing crimson spikes which every Christmastide renew throughout the wild forests, of which he would have made a civilized garden, the memory of the last and best of the Spanish governors. So Trinidad became English, and Picton ruled it for a while with a rod of iron. I shall not be foolish enough to enter here into the merits or demerits of the Picton case, which once made such a noise in England. His enemies' side of the story will be found in Macallum's Travels in Trinidad, his friends' side in Robinson's Life of Picton. Two books, each of which will seem, I think, to him who will read them alternately, rather less wise than the other. But those who may choose to read the two books must remember that questions of this sort have not two sides merely, but more, being not superficies, but solids, and that the most important side is that on which the question stands, namely its bottom, which is just the side which neither party like to be turned up, because under it, at least in the West Indies, all the beetles and cockroaches, centipedes and scorpions are nestled away out of sight, and there, as long since decayed, they, or their exuvae and dead bodies, may remain. The good people of Trinidad have long since agreed to let bygones be bygones, and it speaks well for the common sense and good feeling of the islanders, as well as for the mildness and justice of British rule, that in 2 generations such a community as that of modern Trinidad should have formed itself out of materials so discordant. That British rule has been a solid blessing to Trinidad, all honest folk know well. Even in Picton's time, the population increased, in 6 years from 17,700 to 28,400, In 1851 it was 69,600, and it is now far larger. But Trinidad has gained by becoming English more than mere numbers. Had it continued Spanish, it would probably be, like Cuba, a slave-holding and a slave-trading island, now wealthy, luxurious, profligate, and Port of Spain would be such another wen upon the face of God's earth as that magnificent abomination, the city of Havana, or, as an almost more ugly alternative, it might have played its part in the great triumph of bliss by Act of Parliament, which set mankind to rights forever. When Mr. Canning did the universe the honour of calling the new world into existence to redress the balance of the old, it might have been, probably would have been, conquered by a band of sympathisers from the neighbouring Republic of Venezuela, and have been called into existence by the massacre of the respectable folk, the expulsion of capital, and the establishment, with a pronunciamento and a revolution every few years, of a republic such as those of Spanish America, combining every vice of civilization with every vice of savagery. From that fate, as every honest man in Trinidad knows well, England has saved the island, and therefore every honest man in Trinidad is loyal, with occasional grumblings, of course, as is the right of freeborn Britons at home and abroad, to the British flag. Chapter 4. Port of Spain. The first thing notable on landing in Port of Spain, at the low quay which has been just reclaimed from the mud of the Gulf, is the multitude of people who are doing nothing. It is not that they have taken an hour's holiday to see the packet come in. You will find them, or their brown duplicates, in the same places tomorrow and next day. They stand idle in the marketplace, not because they have not been hired, but because they do not want to be hired, being able to live like the Lazzaroni of Naples on midshipman's half pay. Nothing a day and find yourself. You are told that there are 8,000 human beings in Port of Spain alone without visible means of subsistence, and you congratulate Port of Spain on being such an Elysium that people can live there, not without eating, for every child and most women you pass are eating something or other all day long, but without working. The fact is that though they will eat as much and more than a European, if they can get it, they can do well without food, and feed, as do the Lazzaroni, on mere heat and light. The best substitute for a dinner is asleep under a south wall in the blazing sun, and there are plenty of south walls in Port of Spain. In the French islands, I'm told, such Lazzaroni are caught up and set to government work, as strong rogues and masterless men, after the ancient English fashion. But is such a course fair? If a poor man neither steals, begs, nor rebels, and these people do not do the two latter, has he not as much right to be idle as a rich man? To say that neither has a right to be idle is, of course, sheer socialism, and a heresy not to be tolerated. Next, the stranger will remark, here as at Granada, that everyone he passes looks strong, healthy, and well fed. One meets few or none of those figures and faces, small, scrofulous,